ancestors. Let's talk about your ancestors, my ancestors, everybody else's ancestors, who they are, and the answer might surprise you just a little bit. It might not be exactly what you think it is, and I'm going to talk about it from a shamanic perspective, the perspective of a shaman, and it's a little bit of an important distinction. My name is John Moore, and I am a shamanic practitioner and teacher. I teach shamanism, I practice shamanism. I live in the state of Maine in the U.S., and let's talk about ancestors. Of course, when you think about ancestors, there is the literal definition of blood ancestors. The people, when you go to Ancestry.com and you look at your family tree, your progenitors, the people who gave birth before you, right? Your mom, your dad, your grandparents on both sides, your great-grandparents on both sides, your great-great-grandparents, and so on and so forth and so forth. And those are ancestors, and they have very important contributions to who you are, as what, both physically, mentally, spiritually, and otherwise. There are other components that are important to that, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. These are very clearly ancestors. We inherit a lot from them. Physically, we get our DNA from these people. So a lot of our physical expression, not all of it, some of that is shaped by our environment, comes from our ancestors, directly from our ancestors. I have blue eyes. Both of my grandfathers had blue eyes. Both of my parents had brown eyes, but blue eyes is a recessive gene, and I have blue eyes on both sides of my family. I don't know if you can tell, but I do have blue eyes. And so, there are lots of things. I look a lot like my dad's side of the family, but you'll also find things that we inherit, good and bad, from our ancestors. So, for example, we have learned recently, scientifically, that we can detect epigenetic changes in the way that our genes express themselves in people who have ancestors who survived significant trauma. For example, the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. We've seen this in animal studies. I want to say like 20 or more generations. These are obviously simple animals like worms and things that we can study 20 generations of. We don't have time to go, obviously it would take, 400 or 500 years to study 20 generations of humans, but we can do this in animal studies. And so we can see the things that happened to us, and this is just on a physical level, that get passed down. So that's sort of your, the definition of an ancestor and how our ancestry affects us. Now, from a shamanic perspective, our blood ancestors are very important. These are beings, they're people. People are beings, so that's accurate. These are people who have died and crossed over. And many, many times, most of the time, they're looking to help us. They're looking to help us out. They have an interest in us doing well. It seems to be a thing, right, where we can call upon our ancestors for strength. We can call upon them for supernatural help in non-ordinary reality, which is the spirit world. It's another term for the spirit world. And they sometimes intervene physically. Sometimes we'll recover from an illness, or that sort of thing. There are there's good and bad, like dealing with any person. There are boundaries and all kinds of stuff. So I have an ancestral altar in my house where I have pictures of my ancestors, things I inherited from my ancestors, set up on this altar. I put I don't like to use the word offerings when it comes to ancestors. I put gifts there for them. Usually food, things that, things that I have, things that they seem to enjoy. And this is common in a lot of cultures. In a lot of Asian cultures, in Chinese culture, Japanese culture, and others, you will see, a small altar in the home. or some things set aside for ancestors, or even they'll go to a temple or whatever and give gifts to ancestors to honor them, to ask for their favor, and that sort of thing. It's important because we also have a spiritual legacy that we inherit from these folks, and in some cultures there is a form of ancestral luck, for lack of a better term. English doesn't have a very good word for this. Luck is not exactly the right word, so I'm going to have to explain around it a little bit. So we inherit certain characteristics, spiritual predilections, certain things. So we can talk about wounding. We already talked about the epigenetic changes that happen to our ancestors. So some of my ancestors came over as a result of the potato famine in Ireland. So I may have inherited some predilection for that, some sense of scarcity, some sense of that sort of thing. And frequently, when we have people who are living in scarcity consciousness or that sort of thing, that's something that gets passed down, and we're not even necessarily conscious of it, right? We're just like, I have to get everything because everything's being taken away, or I'm going to starve, or whatever, what have you. So that is an important inheritance, right? That sort of, those patterns, for lack of a better term. Again, luck is not a perfect word for that, but ancestral patterns, things that live out again and again in our line until somebody, hopefully us, works on those and heals them, right? So I've talked about before coming from a background of trauma. I had significant childhood trauma. I grew up in a home with domestic violence and substance abuse and child abuse and really just scary situation a lot of the time. And I won't go into detail, not because I am not fine talking about it, but I don't want to make my trauma your trauma. I don't want to trigger anybody who has been through similar stuff, and I'm not here to trauma dump. Just background information. I decided when I was very young, as did, I'm assuming my brother made a similar decision, that stops with us. We are absolutely putting an end to that. And I'm sure there was trauma in generations past. That's just how people were. And there was a lot of stuff. My grandfather lost his father when he was, I think, in 8th grade, so about 12 or 13 years old. He lost his father and had to drop out of school and go to work. And there's probably all kinds of stuff that has gotten passed along, trauma-wise. But when you heal that, it kind of stops the movement. It stops that from being passed forward. There's this concept in sort of Old Norse spirituality of the humming-ya, which is, the humming-ya is, again, it's ancestral, quote-unquote, luck. It's this energy that we have that gets inherited. So when I die, essentially, I pass that energy on to my children. It gets passed on when I die. Well, there's certain things I don't want to pass on to my children. I don't want to pass that energy on, so I have to change it. In this life, I have to put this on. So that is an important consideration, one of the reasons we work with ancestors. We also work with ancestors we communicate with them to get knowledge, growth, healing, all kinds of things. And the thing that is difficult for some people is that we all have jerks in our family tree somewhere. Maybe immediately, maybe further back. What do we do about that? What do we do if my grandfather was a murderer? Or what do we do if my, great-grandfather was a horse thief? Or, all of those things. There's a couple of ways we can approach this when dealing with ancestral stuff. One is you have to understand that when a person dies, a lot of that trauma, wounding stuff gets stripped away from the part of them that crosses over. As long as that part crosses over, they go to what has been colloquially referred to as spirit school, where the egoic stuff doesn't matter anymore. When you die, you don't have pain and worry and all of this stuff anymore, so it's like this releasing of burdens. Now, a lot of that exacerbates the jerkiness of the egoic personality. So there's a long way of saying people change when they cross over to the other side. Right? So if there's if you want to work with your ancestors, but there's a psychological block for you to say, I am not working with my grandfather, he was a bad person, whatever, then that's fine. Don't work with your deceased grandfather. Or it might be a growth experience for you to work with this person who has crossed over and has been changed by the death experience. Talk about an initiation. We think of death as a finality, as an ending, but from a shamanic point of view, I think of death as sort of one of the bigger initiations in life. Birth being one, death being another, rebirth, all kinds of stuff. Those are big, big, big initiations. And initiations change you. I had a really great comment on a YouTube video that I did recently that was talking about initiation and talking about how it really shakes up your world. And the commenter, and thank you if you are the person who commented this on my video. I love this, and I want to give you credit, but I can't remember what your name is at this point. I'm sorry, but if you go back and look at my video on initiations, you can see that comment there. Said that they describe it as like the seed for a tree, and that the seed gets completely destroyed so that this beautiful tree can grow. It's obliterated. There's nothing left of this seed when the tree grows. And that is a beautiful way of describing initiation, that our ego and our personality gets really broken down so that something beautiful can flourish out of that. So death is a big, big, big initiation. So at the beginning of this video, I said that I would talk about who our ancestors are, being perhaps a little bit surprising, perhaps not what you expect, perhaps not what you think of when somebody says the word ancestors. And so I'm going to talk about that now, because I try to fulfill my promises. But one of the concepts that I learned when I was going through training in shamanism is that we have what we consider non-human ancestors. So I'm going to break it down into some groups, and this is just my way of dividing this up, and I will explain what each of these things are. So we have the ancestors that I have talked about already, the ones that we are directly descended from, we might call ancestors of the blood, right? People that, are blood relations, people that we have inherited DNA from. We also have non-human ancestors. We have, and so there's a couple of different categories of those. One is we have ancestors of place. So I'm living in an area where there may be spirits living here that were here before me, and while they didn't necessarily give birth to me, they do influence my life, and I interact with them. I don't try to chase them off unless they are a stuck spirit or that sort of thing. But there are all kinds of nature spirits. There may be humans who lived here that crossed over and come back to look in on the place. Those are not stuck spirits, aka ghosts. So I'm not going to, help them cross over, chase them off, or anything like that. So there's ancestors of place, and those are considered ancestors in shamanism because we can work with them, we can gain power from them, we can give gifts to them. So we work with them very much in the same way that we work with blood ancestors. It just happens to be where we are, particularly where we live, is extremely important. it's important to honor them and have a good and be in good relationship with them. They will take care of the place in which you live. From a non-physical perspective, some of that bleeds over into the physical state. They will offer a level of protection, and in many cultures, there are spirits that they offer to take care of things, take care of the farm, take care of the animals, take care of the plants, take care of the trees, and protect the barn from fire, and all of these things. Lots of cultural beliefs around that. So those are sort of ancestors of place. Those ancestors I sort of consider, I would call them non-human people. They tend to be nature spirit type beings that we might call like elves or gnomes or brownies or halflings, or there's a million different names for these non-human people. If you can see into non-ordinary reality, frequently they appear human-like. Not always completely human. Frequently they show up as little people. There are little people in almost every culture in the world, from leprechauns, elves, and fairies, to Menehune in Hawaii, to Kuntomble in West Africa. These little spiritual beings exist in cultures everywhere, and there's a reason for that. People who can see into non-ordinary reality can actually see and interact with these beings. These beings also happen to live at a layer of reality that's very close to physical reality, and given enough energy and power, sometimes they can pop in and we can see and experience them with almost physically, but we're experiencing non-physical reality. One of my very first experiences with nature beings of this sort, little people, I was in my early 20s. I was training in martial arts. I was in my martial arts studio, which was in the basement of this building in Boston. And I was training with one other guy. And in another room, my teacher was in this other room. We were the only ones in the building, and there was a big door that you had to come in a little hallway before you got into the dojo area. So my buddy Jimmy and I were working out and training, and all of a sudden I see, without the door opening, I see this little man about 2 feet tall, kind of pudgy, but looks fairly human, but greenish in color, like completely greenish in color, wearing a hat and everything, just run through the room and go through the back wall, like as if the back wall wasn't solid. So like when you see in the movies a spirit run through the wall, that's what it looked like to me. It stunned me because it seemed very real, but I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things, that I had hallucinated this. Something was going on, because that was beyond what I was prepared to believe. My friend, who I was training with, turned to me and said, "Oh my God, did you see that?" And I said, "I don't know. What did you see?" And then he described exactly what I saw. We saw the same thing. About a minute later, my martial arts teacher, walked into the room and said, "What happened to that little guy who came running through here?" So 3 of us, one of us not in the same room and didn't overhear the conversation that we had experienced exactly the same thing. Since then, I've lots and lots of experiences, but that was one of the first experiences I had that was very shocking. So we treat these beings as ancestors. The other sort of non-blood ancestor or spiritual ancestor that we might have are non-human physical being ancestors, right? So we inherit ancestral energy from non-human beings. We have, in our past, I don't happen to believe that human beings were plunked here on Earth by God 6,000 years ago. I believe we evolved from other beings, and at some point, all life on Earth was a single-celled organism. So everything that is living extended from from that same organism, and then that became I don't know what came after that, more and more complex things, until eventually humans evolved out of all of that, out of early primates, early mammals, early whatever. We were all fish at one point, or at least something swimming around in the ocean before we walked on land. And an interesting fact that sharks have actually been on Earth longer than trees. Think about that for a moment. So we're connected to all of these things. And so we have non-human ancestors as well. Some of those are living beings. The other way that we can think about this is we can think about, from an animistic perspective, rocks and rivers and mountains and hills and all kinds of things as spiritual beings. And one way this was described to me as these things, rocks and trees and rivers and whatever, these forms, because spirit is essentially formless, is that form is a medium for spirit. In other words, if I hold up a pen, this pen is a medium for spirit. That means there is spirit in this pen. This pen is a spirit. I look at it as this pen is a spirit. It has physicality, but there is spirit in everything. And so some of that stuff we are very, very closely connected to. Either because we are living in proximity to it, or our ancestors were, or that sort of thing. And those can be non-human ancestors, and we can inherit characteristics from them, and we can give them gifts, make offerings, work with them on a spiritual level. To do that requires a bit of shamanic training. You have to learn quite a lot you have to learn before you can work with a stone as an ancestor, or a lizard, or whatever. But it can be done, and there's an incredible amount of knowledge, an incredible amount of power that can be gathered from all of our ancestors. So we have our blood ancestors, our ancestors of place, and kind of other non-human ancestor category, which could include spirits without form, and then spirits that are inhabiting form. All form has a spiritual component to it. And so I think one of the Buddhist sutras actually said that, says, and maybe the Heart Sutra, I'm not sure, I don't remember, but says that form and formlessness are the same. Just meaning that what we see as solid and spiritual reality are the same thing. And that the physical world is actually out-projecting of the spiritual, of consciousness. Anyway, been talking for a while. I wanted to talk about ancestors. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will talk to you real soon.